Hello, everybody. Today on Talk About Your Community, I am really pleased to welcome back a guest who I've had before, Martina Pocchiari from the Erasmus Research Institute of Management. And she is a researcher in online communities. And we're going to be talking today about a lot of her research projects, but in particular, one about how community spaces can react to disruptive events that threaten the identity of that community. So stay tuned and we'll be right back. And welcome back. And before we begin, please, if you will, subscribe, comment, and share if this is interesting content to you. Always try to bring in interesting perspectives and ideas about building online community spaces. So without further ado, let me go ahead and bring Martina into the stream. Martina, it's so great to see you again. Thank you for joining.
Hello, Todd. I'm so happy to be back. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so I think you were on the live stream show back in the July timeframe, and at the time you were talking a little bit about community research that you were doing around digitization. I can't talk today. Digitization of online events and their impact. People's willingness to or desire to sign up and then actually show up for events. Am I getting that right?
That is correct. Yes, yes, you remember correctly.
Now, that was all part of your dissertation work, correct?
It is. It is part of my dissertation work, together with the project on disruptive events, the ones that you have mentioned in the introduction. Together, those are the chapters of my dissertation for my doctorate degree.
And I mean, the work you're doing stands out to me because, I mean, I try to track a lot of the academic research that happens in online communities, but the things you're doing are super relevant. And one of the things that I love is that you're actually plugged into things like CMX and places where people are talking actively about the profession of community management. So it's not just that you're living away in an ivory tower somewhere, it's that you're in the trenches and you're listening to and talking to people that are working in this space.
Yes, I really, really love that aspect, being actually involved with the professionals who work with communities and who base their careers around communities. I want to know what they're struggling with, what their main problems are, and how my research can help them possibly solve those problems or at least address them. In those experiences, I also met very nice people, excellent people. I am still in contact with some of the community managers I met through CMX or other community management spaces. And so I'm very grateful that I was welcome there first as a researcher, even though I'm not a community professional myself, and for those connections that I created.
Well, that is something I will say as an aside that, I mean, I've been in the community management space now for many years, probably going back to 2013 or even earlier. And one of the striking things is just how open and welcoming that group of professionals are. It's a very collegiate bunch of people that care about these spaces online, and I'm glad you're a part of that group.
Thank you. I really have to agree.
So
very nice people.
If I can ask Martina, I always kind of ask people's origin stories with communities because it hasn't been a category or profession until fairly recently. What got you interested in this space? What attracted you to it in the first place?
Yeah, as a researcher, the first contact I had with communities was from my personal experience. Ever since I was a teenager, and I am a 90s kid, so it's not that I always had access to the internet or to online community spaces. So ever since I was a teenager, those were the first real years where I had continuous access to internet. I was always part of some form of online community around my favorite music bands or about my favorite TV shows or any other interests that I had. I also like to design the let's say, the layouts or the images in the HTML website
Yes.
then. So I was also involved in that, and I stayed a member of communities growing up and becoming a researcher. And so naturally, I had questions from my experience as a user and as a member of these communities that sticked with me and stayed with me over time. And finally, when I became a researcher in 2017, I had the opportunity to explore some of those questions from the perspective of a social science researcher.
I love that. That's amazing. Now you set yourself up for this. I need to ask you what your bands were in the 90s that you were a big fan of.
No, I was born in the 90s, but I was
Oh,
following 2000, early 2000 bands, which is already giving away that they were not very good bands. So yeah, a fairly famous one was Tokyo Hotel in
okay.
2006 or 7, I think that was, and I was 12 or 13, crazy about them, and I was designing the fan club graphics, designs for their forums.
Oh,
So
very neat. Well, you were definitely a fan then. If you were
I was
designing
a
banners
fan.
for
I
them.
was a kid with a lot of free time
Yeah.
and curiosity for computer stuff.
Well, I mean, I think that sort of hobby and play and fandoms are an entry for a lot of people into community building. I know my entry to it was through online games and multiplayer, collaborative play spaces, and that was very informal. It was discussion forums, and I was designing things for those and writing poetry and crazy stuff. But so it's such a creative outlet, and
Mhm.
now it's become a natural progression into an actual career, which
Mhm.
is really exciting to see.
Yes.
So if I could ask you, Erasmus Research Institute of Management, for people that aren't familiar with that, why did you choose there to go to school, and do they have sort of like a specialization around communities and online communities, or is something in the social sciences there that attracted you?
Yeah, I work in the marketing management department, and I specialize in quantitative marketing, which is a subfield of marketing in which we try to model the behavior of consumers in different circumstances or in different situations using econometric models, machine learning models, mathematical models, try to capture and synthesize human behavior with these kind of equations and modeling techniques. This is one part of what the marketing management department does. The other side is the consumer behavior side. They try to understand the behavior of consumers using experiments, both in the lab, in behavioral labs, and with field experiments. So collaborating with companies or with organization, nonprofits, to understand different relationships between some marketing tools or some marketing prompts and the reaction of consumers in the market.
Great.
That's what the marketing management department does. And then ERIM, which is the Institute of Management where we work, actually also has other departments like finance, organizational behavior, and general management. They do all sorts of cool research. You can find everything about it on the ERIM website if anybody is curious. We're always very happy to share about our work and the cool things that we study.
That's great. I'm very glad to give them a shout out. Sometimes I know with some of the graduate study that I did many moons ago, I went to a particular institution because there was a professor or professors who were particularly, great thought leaders or had some really interesting things to offer. Was there anybody that you wanted to give a shout out to that has been a big influence on you that you've been working with over there?
Yeah, certainly my daily supervisor, Jason Roos. He's also an expert in quantitative marketing. And together we study both the digitization and of community experiences project that you briefly mentioned before. We're both involved in that. And we also have another project on the consumption of fake news in digital platforms. So certainly he has had a great influence on my career. He's been my supervisor since 2017. There are other colleagues in my department who study social networks, social influence, who might be interesting for people who work with community spaces. Those are Shi Chen, and Maciek Siwanowski. So in case you are interested about social influence and social networks and the consumption of digital products, certainly pay a visit to their websites.
I am particularly interested because of a client right now asking about social network mapping. So I may take you up on that at a later date,
Yes.
maybe for a quick introduction. So I wanted to come back to your research topics, though. And today, in particular, I was hoping we could maybe do a little bit of a deeper dive on the other topic that we didn't get a chance to talk about the last time, which is about how community spaces can or do react to disruptive events, identity, purpose-threatening sorts of events. And I know you've delved into this extensively. There was a research team you worked with on this. Maybe it was some of the people you mentioned already. But can you maybe give us an overview of how you ended up interested in the project and sort of where it's taken you in your learning so far?
Yes, absolutely. So the team of researchers I work on this topic, I work with on this topic, are Yaniv Dover, who is an assistant professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, also in marketing. Pinar Ilidrim, who is an assistant professor at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania, in the marketing department, and Abdullah Matuk, who is also assistant professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management in Information System. So this is the research team, and with them I developed 2 research projects about the way communities react to disruptive external events that can potentially threaten the purpose for which the community was initially formed, and even the existence of the community following the disruption. The origin of the 2 projects was tied to the fact that we are increasingly seeing that communities are very quick and influential in reacting to external events. Very famous case, it's been about a year ago. We have seen, for example, the community of retail investors on Reddit reacting to the news that the market was, the hedge funds were short selling the game shares.
That was the Robinhood sell-off,
Yeah.
right? Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
It was the Wall Street Bets subreddit, and that is a very famous case of how just learning about something from the market or from external news sources can have a very deep influence on the way communities react and assemble, and even the influence that they can have on the world, because they effectively disrupted the global financial market for like a week. And caused a gazillion dollar losses for the hedge funds that were involved. And then shortly after, actually, I think that the 2 events kind of overlapped, but we have also seen that the Capitol Hill riots in January 2021, those were also the result of grassroots organization in online communities, right? So people organizing in these online spaces, taking and responding to external inputs about themselves or news about themselves or news about the government, and then taking action that actually threaten the course of democracy. So we are increasingly seeing these kind of things, how external and seemingly exogenous news or events prompt people to come together and gather in these online spaces, and their reaction then has an impact on the markets, on the politics, on our everyday lives. So that's why we are interested broadly in the topic. And then we developed 2 different projects. One with Dr. Yaniv Dover. We want to study how disrupting the purpose for which the communities were initially established, what is the impact of that purpose disruption on the way people interact with each other in the community, in terms of volume of activity, the kind of content that they share with each other, and the structure of the social network of interactions that underlies the community. And instead, with Dr. Pinar Ilidrim and Dr. Almatuk, we focus on brand communities, so communities that were formed around products or services or brands. And we want to understand how events that threaten the reputation of the brand, so effectively brand crisis events, How do these impact the consumers who are part of the brand communities? Do these consumers talk more about the brand, and in which terms they talk more about the brand, and which kind of consumers are most affected and most negatively affected? Is it the most loyal consumers, or is the kind of brand disloyal people who come onto the community and take over the conversation and steer the conversation in whatever direction, which might not be ideal for a brand managing this kind of crisis situation? Very long.
No. So this is amazing. So it's a topic that concerns me greatly as somebody working in online communities, and the disruptive ways that it cuts both ways. There's potentially good things that it could mobilize a group of people to take social action on a topic very quickly. But it's also worrisome in terms of the kinds of cult-like behavior you can even see in some kinds of community experiences, like the insurrection, the Capitol riots. It's easy to say, oh, well, they were all on these major social media platforms like Twitter and then Parler, and like it's the big social media platforms with their algorithms that just reinforce beliefs and ways of looking at things. But it's not just that. It's also subreddits. It's also private online communities. And for me, that's like an arrow in the heart, because I'm not to say that private online community experiences can't be evil, or have have manipulative or nefarious ways of acting, immoral ways of acting, but I think more often than not, there's greater opportunity for innocence and for good intent, in those more private online spaces. But they can also be an echo chamber for all kinds of propaganda, conspiracy theories. Whether it's a government is the bad actor or there's a group of individuals who are bad actors. This is deeply concerning, and it's a threat to the social contract of society, I think, in a lot of cases.
Absolutely, yes, it can be. And so it is so important for us to understand the dynamics of these events. For example, in the project about the purpose disruption, you can think of a purpose disruption as an attack on the reason for which people gathered in the first place. And so in the context, as you are saying, of this political these politically heavy groups, you can think, what happens if you directly attack them from an external source? So you're a news source, you're a news provider, and you attack those groups directly, saying you shouldn't exist, and the purpose for which you exist is not right, and is wrong, and is terrible, and so all of you are terrible for that reason. What happens when you attack them? So when the purpose of their existence is disrupted, it's so important for social science and for society to understand what happens in those cases. Are these people going to ignite the conversations? Are they going to rally together more? Or are these attacks useful, and effective in kind of dispersing their conversations?
It's very interesting, because I wonder, my initial reaction to that is saying nothing can catalyze an online community like having a common enemy or a shared enemy. So if that opposition rises, I feel this happens in a lot of communities where if they've got something really specific to react against, that's a rallying point, and it actually increases that sense of belonging within that group.
Yeah, absolutely. I observe this kind of behavior. I actually observe different types of behavior across the projects that I am working on. So in the case of the purpose shocks, I compare, for example, positive versus negative purpose. I call them shocks. In economic terms, that just means disruption. So positive versus negative purpose disruptions. And now these two generate different reactions from the community. I studied these in the context of sport communities. So communities of NCAA basketball fan groups on Reddit. And in that context, I find that negatively impacting the purpose of the group, which is the team around which they have gathered. So a poor team performance, a bad team performance is reasonably a kind of attack on why the group exists. If the team is not doing well, that means, well, why are we here, right? What has it been about? And in that situation, we find actually that this kind of poor performance attack on the purpose, they decrease fan engagement. So fans are less likely to go on the community and talk to each other after the purpose of their group has been threatened by a poor performance. We also find that the structure of their conversation changes. So who talks to whom is also affected by this kind of negative performance event. And then we find that what they are telling to each other also changes. And interestingly, what you mentioned was the sense of group or the sense of affiliation. That is one of the things that we find is most impacted in the way people converse and discuss with each other after these kind of performance disruptions. We find that the likelihood that they talk about group and affiliation decreases, so they feel less part of a collective after this kind of poor performance. That is different from what we find in the brand communities. There we don't talk about purpose shock explicitly. It's more brand misbehavior and corporate misbehavior. Arguably, it is a subset of purpose shock. But there we find actually that the conversations are ignited after a brand crisis. Supposedly, we imagine that is because consumers go onto these communities probably to find more information about what happened, to give their perspective about what happened. And then there in that different context, we find what you were suggesting, that these kind of negative events ignite and boost the conversations in these online communities. So I guess first takeaway, if we want to call it like that, is that there is no unique way that communities react to these kind of external events. Depends on the context, on the type of shock, on the type of event, and the type of disruption, who is disrupted, and then we can draw different conclusions.
And it's based on the kind of community too, based on what you're saying, a brand community versus other sorts of communities of interest or involvement in a cause or whatever that happens.
Yeah, actually, even within brand communities, we don't find a homogeneous response. We find that it actually depends on the product category, on the type of crisis that we record, if it's more moral and ethical, or if it's more related to labor force or to legal infringements. So even within the same kind of community, the response depends on the circumstances. And our objective is to clarify as much as possible these circumstances so that managers can learn more about what they can expect from these kind of situations and how they can better manage people that are disrupted in their community experiences.
So in brand communities where there is a moral failing on the part of a company, are you finding that almost works in a negative fashion towards
Yes.
the member? Like they'll say, well, I don't know
Yes.
if I want to log back into this discussion group again.
Ethical and legal, I believe. Ethical for sure. I need to check the results for the legal, but for ethical crisis, we find disengagement from the brand community. There is evidence from the psychology and marketing literature on how these kind of ethical transgressions are heavier for consumers to process compared to, for example, product failures or kind of labor force mishaps. So we find evidence of that.
And I wanted to go back to you had the sports team example, a group of fans for a sports team, and if they had poor team performance, you said it affects who talks to who, and then you said it changes what they talk about. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more? Like who talks to who is very interesting to me. Like what is the difference that you saw in that and how that worked out?
Yeah, I will take a step back before talking about the results to maybe explain a bit how we measured
Oh,
these
yes, please. I was going
things.
to ask about methodology a little bit. Yeah.
Because yeah, so otherwise the results are not easily comprehensible. So what we did to understand who talks to whom before and after these kind of performance disruptions, we are studying in the Reddit context. Okay, so it's discussion threads. We constructed social network structures based on who is responding to which thread or which comment. So if two people are commenting on the same thread, then they are two nodes in the same social network, and they are connected by a link.
Mhm.
And we do this iteratively. So we construct these kind of networks based on who is responding to whom and who is commenting on which thread and so on. And so from this social network, we are able to build one social network before the performance, after the performance, and then compare the two structures and see if anything has substantively changed due to the fact that the performance was poor or was very good. And in that context, we basically find changes to the discussion network of who is talking to which people and how many comments they're leaving and to whom. And so we find changes in the number of people, of different people that any average member talks to. So let's say before the poor performance, after the poor performance compared to before, we find that people talk to fewer unique members than they did before. Similarly, we find an effect on the likelihood. We find an effect on the likelihood that two people who are talking to the same person are also going to talk to each other. That's called clustering coefficient. So we find an effect on the number of unique people, on the likelihood that two neighbors in the network will also talk to each other, and on the number of, the technical term is cohesive blocks. You can think of it as sort of islands of discussions that are not connected by any common user. So we find that these poor performances also affect the likelihood that people will form discussion islands that are separate from each other. And so that's more or less how we measure and how we find that the who talks to who changes. It's a bit technical, but maybe it's interesting to know also how that changes.
It's super interesting. I think the people that watch this stream, they're gonna have a deep interest in this, because I think this has to do deeply with the kinds of behaviors you see in a lot of different kinds of online communities. I was
Yeah.
trying to puzzle out that tendency to not talk to people outside of your nodes. I think it was the terminology you were using. If the team performed poorly, and I was trying to think, like, why is that? What is the underlying reason? I'm going to guess, and tell me if I'm off the mark with this. So my team lost. I'm not likely to try to talk to other people outside of who I know, because I don't want to be bummed out by what they're going to say. I want to, I'm more likely to talk to my friend about something else in the community other than the team's performance, or maybe
Mhm.
something to distract myself or make myself feel better in the
Mhm.
meantime. So, but if the team is doing really well, I want to share that with other people, and so I'm
Mhm.
more open to meeting and talking to other people. In those cases,
Mhm.
does that feel right to you?
That
Is
is
that borne
one
out?
possibility. I think there is no unique explanation for what we find. That is true in social sciences in general. There are competing explanations, and one of the things that we always try to do in our papers is trying to rule out at least some of these competitive explanations. And so that what you said is one possibility. What we observe is actually tied to the reduction in activity. So simply people are talking less after poor performances, and so naturally they also talk to fewer unique members and less with each other's social network neighbors. So in that case, I think it's more mechanic.
Mhm.
The reason is more mechanic. So there are fewer conversations, and so you will also observe that the network structure changes in a way that accommodates fewer conversations. But as to a behavioral explanation, certainly there might be let's say, an interest in talking about something else, maybe outside of the community after this poor performance. But actually, in other contexts, not much in sports, but for example, in finance community, it has been observed that people still interact after some kind of negative performance, for example, a poor stock market performance or a price abnormality. So they still interact there, but they look for different content. And in finance community, they found, there was a study in 2016, I believe, they found that people look for more informative content after this kind of poor market performance.
Interesting.
They are trying to reduce their uncertainty about the future, and they go into these communities to find out more, maybe from the experts who are there, who can give you more reliable info about what's going on, and more timely, because often in the community you can find quicker access to information than you would find in, let's say, media channels or news channels.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I'm charmed by that idea of communities as a place to reduce uncertainty, and that it's a place to celebrate when things are going well, but when things aren't going well, it's a place where we can almost surround ourselves by others who are also trying to figure out, like, okay, well, what went wrong, or how do we fix the situation, or how do we go from there? That's really fascinating.
They are complex spaces. That's, if there is one thing I learned in 5 years studying them, these are complex places. You can find people who are trying to reduce their uncertainty. You can find people who are so offended or threatened in their self and social identity by something bad that they drop it, like, completely. They choose to turn off the laptop and disengage for a while, and then maybe come back later when they're more calm or more inclined to interact again. And this might be especially the case for people who have a certain status in the community. If you have a very strong attachment, it might be way too psychologically costly to keep interacting with a community that is experiencing a performance failure.
Because it's an identity threat, and I've associated myself with the values of that community.
It can be an identity threat. It can be a status threat. It can be a threat to your expertise. And some people just don't have the mental budget to deal with that kind of threat. And so some people choose to disengage, and some people instead choose to stay and fight. And so in these projects, that also what we are interested in studying, like who stays and who leaves, and what are their profiles, how do these people look like.
There's so much here, and I have to say, I really admire the language that you're deploying to talk about these concepts, because there's new terminology here for me, but I get it, and I get why you're talking about these things. Really interesting. So you mentioned that what gets talked about changes a little bit in those cases, and so you said with the finance community, for example, they look into other kinds of things that would reduce their uncertainty. Is that true for other areas aside from the financial world? Like what happens in more politically oriented communities or sports teams or things like that? What
I can talk about the sports teams, because that's where we record the language changes. Not yet for the brands. We are on the text analysis for the brand. So if it is interesting to also know how that is done, we basically pull out all the text of the conversations on Reddit. So all the discussion text, and we process it through text analysis algorithms. We use several. We have used the language inquiry and word count algorithm, for example, or the hedonometer algorithm. And we process the text through those algorithms to find some scores in terms of, for example, how emotional a text is, or how analytical the text is, or what parts of the speech have been used most frequently in a given comment or in a given submission on Reddit. And so using those kind of metrics, we are able, as I said before, to isolate the before text from the after text, and then compare on average what changes in the content of the conversations. And so from those analyses, we find in the sport communities that after poor team performances, people share fewer energetic kind of words. So the energy level of the discussions decreases. People share fewer emotional words as well. So the kind of emotional energy of the conversation goes down after these poor performances. As I hinted before, also the sense of affiliation, and the use of group-related words, which include also, for example, the use of we pronouns. So we as a pronoun in sentences, the use of that kind of words goes down after these poor performances.
Mhm.
And then there is also a shift in the time orientation. So whether people focus more on past or on the future or on the present, that is also affected by these kind of performances. And so you can think of these performances affecting the energy of the conversations, the affiliation, the sense of affiliation and group membership, and whether people choose to continue talking about the past, maybe in a way to analyze what happens, or more focus on the future, maybe in a way to be more wishful about a better performance, maybe in a future world. Yeah.
So I guess my mind turns to, if I'm a community manager, what do I do? What do I take from this, and how do I use it to be aware of how my community is impacted, and how I can maybe can I even react to intervene in some of these negative trends, if they happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what I told and recounted so far was kind of the first stage of the study about the sport communities, because first we wanted to establish that something happened, and how much did it happen, and what was moving, and how much was it moving. And then we stepped into, okay, what can managers do, and what can they learn from these situations? And in that sense, we explored two possible paths for community managers. One is the role of expectations and the management of expectations about these kind of events, the likelihood that something bad will happen, and the other is the content moderation. So moderating the discussions prior to a poor performance. In terms of expectations, that was kind of clever. We exploited the fact that games, so team performances, they have prediction markets associated with them, right? So they have betting markets. People place bets on what is more likely to happen. We collected data about all the point spreads for the games that we
Interesting. Okay.
recommended. And so we know more or less, with assuming efficiency of the large betting markets, um, we have a sense of what the community was expecting from the performance. Was it a very clear loss to be expected, or could they have expected more or less a tied outcome or a clear win? And what happens when those expectations are met and when those expectations are not met? So when the outcome of the game was actually the opposite of what was predicted. And so we find that the expectations of the fans actually play a very big role into how they will react. Probably it can be expected that when the expectations are failed, so when something that you did not expect actually happens and happens negatively, then the reaction is much stronger and is much more negative. So people will disengage more and more strongly than they did when they kind of expected the loss. And so, first takeaway for the community managers, you can play with expectations, with expectation management. If you have a sense that something bad is going to happen or some disruption to your community is going to happen, talk to your members, prepare them, give them the tools to understand and expect the event, and that will preserve or that will mitigate the possible disruption in the community activity and on the social network. So that is for the expectations. And then we also explored the role of moderating content, because something we thought was, okay, maybe people are disengaging after a poor performance because they might expect maybe people being enraged or not behaving very well, or maybe they will attack each other. And so they might be concerned with, this kind of poor behavior from the members. And indeed, we find that if there is a content moderation enforced 48 hours prior to the poor performance, then the negative effect of the performance is mitigated. So it's less negative if you moderate content prior to that. And so the second takeaway might be make sure that people know that content is being moderated, so that when something bad happens, they know they can feel safer. engaging in the community. That is one possible explanation of what we find.
That's really fascinating, and I'm very keen on those topics of trust and safety in online spaces for people to feel like they can contribute, freely in what they do. But I hadn't really thought about that whole moderation process, giving people that sense of a safety net. There's somebody watching here to make sure that the conversation doesn't get out of hand, is important. So when you're talking about moderation, you're talking about giving warnings for bad posts or abusive kinds of things, threatening kinds of things. Not somebody necessarily saying, "Yeah, we lost, we're going to lose, we're going to keep losing," like that. There's pessimism, and then there's things that are clearly
No,
violations of
no, we are
community. Right.
no, we are looking at clear violations, and the way that we measured the enforcement of moderation of content was whether actually anything was removed by the moderator. So if there were any clear violations of the community norms.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Martina, this is such an interesting topic. I'm eager to see what comes out with the completed research when it does, and I definitely want you to come back and talk to us about the corporate findings, or the brand community findings, because I think that's going to be
Yeah, that'd be
equally.
lovely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Once we have a more clear picture and some clear cut results, I would love to tell you more.
Yeah, and I always feel like I learn so much. Like the times when I've been looking down when you're talking, I'm actually taking notes. There's terminology you're using. It's like, oh, I just want to remember this. This is a really good way to talk about it. So I always learn so much from these. So thank you. So I wanted to ask you what's next for you. You're graduating with your Ph.D. Coming this summer.
Hopefully.
Yes.
That's the plan. That is the plan. Hopefully, fingers crossed. I hope all the people listening will cross fingers for me that I will graduate. Everything is set. But we'll see. But the plan is to graduate in the summer, and then I will start a new job during the summer. I will be an assistant professor of marketing at the National University of Singapore, the NUS Business School. And then as an assistant professor, my goal is to continue working on the topic of community management, digitization, and disruptive events, basically wrapping up my dissertation projects and publishing them. And I will continue also my other streams of research in information consumption and fake news on digital platforms, and the consumption of digitized products, in general.
Well, I think that's amazing, and I think that the National University of Singapore will be very lucky to have you, because you're brilliant. And I would love to talk another time a little bit more about fake news consumption and disinformation and misinformation in online spaces, because it's a plague, for us. And what are some ways that we can mitigate those kinds of activities in our online spaces? Obviously, we moderate things that are false and provably false, but in what ways do we do it to build community and to deconstruct identities that are clearly radicalizing and a danger to society? I mean, I think it's on everybody's minds, right now, but especially those of us that are managing online community spaces, how we react to those kinds of blatant or even unknowing attempts to influence a community with information that's not real.
Yeah, that's actually, we take a more fundamental approach, and we ask ourselves an even more fundamental question. And the question is, what is fake news? Like, what elements of a piece of information make it classified as fake versus disinformation versus misinformation versus just a mistake, editorial mistake? We argue that there are several elements of a piece of information that, when moved or when manipulated, shift the piece towards being classified as fake news and perceived as fake news by people who read it. We try to do this in a very simple, clean, experimental setting, in a way that then can be used by other researchers to study fake news in, for example, platforms or communities, as you were suggesting.
Well, I'm fascinated by that topic as well. So we've got at least two more times I need to have you back on the show to talk about these things.
Sounds
Um,
great.
Martina, I'm so grateful for your insights and all that you bring, and there's such richness to the conversations that we get to have. I'm just grateful that you're able to join me today. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
No, thank you. It's lovely as usual to be on your show, and looking forward to the next times.
Excellent, excellent. And for those of you out there, if you have a research topic that you care about, if there's some areas of online community management or you're thinking about an online community, reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you in the comments about how your journey is going, what kinds of challenges you're coming up against, and I'm happy to help however I can. So you can reach out to me and find more information at clocktoweradvisors.com. In the meantime, until we meet again, and I will talk to you again soon, Martina. Thank you again.
Yes, thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.